My father refused to walk me down the aisle because my younger sister, his obvious favorite, manipulated him into believing that he could only escort one daughter on her wedding day. She forced him to choose, and of course, he picked her. But just a week before my wedding, he suddenly appeared at my doorstep, eyes red and filled with regret, pleading for a second chance. Turns out, my sister had changed her mind and opted to have our mom's wealthy new boyfriend take his place instead. To make matters worse, she managed to con my father into covering the entire cost of her wedding before casting him aside. But this time, I stood my ground. I've never been the type to seek revenge, but there's something deeply satisfying about watching karma work its magic. And that's exactly what happened. I can't deny the immense sense of justice I feel. And if that makes me a bad daughter or a cold-hearted person, so be it. After years of emotional neglect and being made to feel like I was never good enough, seeing my father get a taste of his own medicine brings me a sense of closure I never thought I'd have. He spent my entire life overlooking me, and now that he has no one else to turn to, he suddenly remembers the daughter he always kept at arm's length. I'm the middle child of 3 siblings. My older brother, Finn for short, is 37, and my younger sister, Sarah, is 29. When we were kids, our family appeared happy on the surface. My parents had their favorites, but at least my mom made an effort to treat us equally. The same cannot be said for my father. His favoritism was blatant, and Sarah was always the center of his world. Finn had a natural edge too, simply because he was the son, and they bonded over manly activities. That left me as the odd one out. Even as a child, I could sense my father's indifference. I remember throwing tantrums, desperately trying to get his attention, but no matter what I did, I was never enough. Over time, I accepted it. I think my mom recognized his bias and tried to compensate for it, which I will always appreciate. If not for her, I might have spent my entire life feeling invisible. Unlike my father, she loved us all the same and made sure I never felt completely alone. Finn noticed it too. He saw how Dad constantly ignored me, and he tried to bridge the gap. When Dad taught him how to change a tire, Finn insisted I be included. When it was time to learn how to drive, he made sure I was in the passenger seat. I know it was his doing because Dad never acknowledged me unless someone else brought me into the conversation. I was never mistreated outright. When it came to material things, I got the same number of gifts and new clothes as my siblings. But emotionally, my father never made space for me. Mom and Finn did their best to fill that void, and for that, I'm grateful. Meanwhile, Sarah basked in her role as the spoiled princess. Even as a child, she was bratty and entitled, and her school repeatedly raised concerns about her attitude, but those warnings were always brushed aside. She grew up to be insufferably self-centered, and as a result, we've never been close. Finn and I, on the other hand, share a strong bond. He can't stand Sarah either. The only one who remains blind to her behavior is Dad. Even Mom barely tolerates her. And yet, after all these years, my father still hasn't learned. He bet everything on the wrong child, and now, he's paying the price. This is where things stand now. About 10 years ago, my parents divorced. It was a peaceful separation, and to this day, none of us truly know the real reason behind it. Mom and Dad insist that they simply weren't compatible anymore. But we all know that's just a convenient excuse. I'm fairly certain infidelity wasn't involved, given that neither of them pursued new relationships for quite some time after the split. Whatever the truth is, they've both chosen to keep it to themselves. Since we were all adults when it happened, there were no messy custody battles, and they've generally maintained a civil relationship over the years. Personally, I've never made much of an effort to visit Dad. Let's be real, there's no deep bond between us, and he doesn't seem to mind my absence, so it works out fine for both of us. When I do have time, I prefer spending it at Mom's, whereas Finn and Sarah make an effort to split their time between both parents. Finn and I sometimes coordinate visits to Mom's, but we actively avoid going when Sarah is there, except for Christmas, when we have no choice. Finn, in particular, has zero tolerance for her. From the outside, our family probably looks fairly normal, but beneath the surface, things have taken a turn for the worse. And honestly, I'm not upset about it. 5 years ago, Mom met Arthur, 60, at a yoga retreat, and they hit it off immediately. He's a great guy, easygoing, respectful, and never oversteps any boundaries. Finn and I get along well with him, and from what I can tell, There's no tension between him and Sarah either. No one has ever mentioned any issues, so I assume they coexist peacefully. Most importantly, Mom is happy, and that's all that really matters. Arthur has also made an effort to be civil with Dad, but Dad, on the other hand, gives him constant attitude. I suspect it's a mix of jealousy and resentment. Unlike Dad, Arthur has a successful career and a much higher income, which means Mom now enjoys a far more comfortable and luxurious lifestyle than she ever did while married to Dad. We're all genuinely happy for her, but Dad seems bitter about the whole situation. His dating life hasn't exactly been thriving either, which only adds to his frustration. The fact that Finn and I have a good relationship with Arthur seems to bother him even more. Finn has tried reasoning with him, explaining that we're not replacing him, just acting like mature adults, but Dad refuses to see it that way. His petty jealousy is exhausting, but thankfully, I don't have to deal with it much since we barely interact. This brings me to recent events. A few months ago, my fiancée, Kieran, 34, proposed to me. We've been together for a long time, and while I didn't announce our engagement right away, I value my privacy. We didn't want a long engagement either. So, once we settled on a date, we finally shared the news with our families. Our wedding is now just a week away. When I broke the news, the reactions were mixed. Mom and Finn were absolutely thrilled, and Arthur was happy for us too. Dad's response was neutral, nothing too enthusiastic, but nothing negative either. Sarah, on the other hand, was visibly upset. We were on a video call, and though she forced a smile, she disconnected shortly after. I knew some kind of tantrum was coming because she absolutely hates not being the center of attention, but I couldn't be bothered with her drama. Later, I called Finn privately to chat and told him I wanted him, not Dad, to walk me down the aisle. He was silent for a moment before admitting that while the request meant a lot to him, he felt it would be inappropriate. He was certain Dad would throw a massive fit over it, and though he'd love nothing more than to be the one by my side, he didn't want to stir up unnecessary conflict. I was hurt by Finn's response. I told him that I had come to him because Dad had failed me time and time again, and he knew that I wanted him standing beside me on my wedding day. He had been more of a protective figure in my life than Dad ever was. It was an emotional conversation, and though I hated to admit it, I knew deep down that he had a point. So, I didn't argue with him. He spoke to me gently, telling me that who walked me down the aisle wasn't the most important thing. What truly mattered was that my wedding day remained as stress-free as possible, so I could look back on it with nothing but happiness. He warned me that if he took on the role, Dad would sulk through the entire event and likely ruin the atmosphere with his pettiness. And he was right. Dad was absolutely capable of pulling a stunt like that. While Finn's reasoning wasn't what I wanted to hear, I knew it would make the day easier for me. He advised me to talk to Dad about it, though I admitted I wasn't thrilled about the idea and needed time to think it over. Then, as if on cue, Sarah made her own big announcement. 2 weeks later, she revealed that she was engaged to her boyfriend, Zach. The moment Kieran and I exchanged glances, I knew she would try to steal the spotlight or pull some dramatic stunt. Finn wasn't too pleased either. We both saw how the timing was suspicious, but since we had no control over it, we had to let it go. One small silver lining? Her wedding was set to take place a month after mine, about 5 weeks from now. It was obvious that she had wanted to rush ahead and get married before me, but the timing simply didn't work in her favor, and that fact burned her. She was incredibly bitter about it, and even tried to guilt-trip me into postponing my own wedding. But I stood my ground. I wasn't about to rearrange my life just to satisfy her ego. If she wanted to be treated like an adult, she needed to grow up. So, things remained as they were. But then came the most ridiculous revelation of all. Apparently, she and Dad had made a pact years ago that he would walk her down the aisle first before anyone else. I have no idea how they even came up with something so absurd. Maybe they assumed I'd never get married or that, given my bad luck with guys in school and college, I'd be single forever. Whatever their reasoning, it was completely deranged. So, when I finally approached Dad to formally ask him to walk me down the aisle, this was after Sarah had already announced her engagement, he gave me his regretful response. He told me that he had promised his baby girl that he would walk her down the aisle first. And apparently, he made this promise years ago when she was on her so-called deathbed, which, for the record, never happened. But according to him, that meant he couldn't go back on his word now, as it would break her heart. So, he wouldn't be able to walk me down the aisle. I won't lie, I was ecstatic. I hadn't wanted him to walk me down the aisle in the first place, but now, he was the one rejecting me. It was the perfect outcome. Of course, I put on a performance, pretending to be devastated and heartbroken over his decision. I even told him that while it hurt me deeply, spoiler, it didn't. I respected his commitment to Sarah. The moment I got off the phone, I called Finn and told him everything. He was furious. He said that if he had known Dad was going to pull this kind of nonsense, he would have agreed to walk me down the aisle from the very beginning. He pointed out that if Dad could pick and choose which daughter got this honor, then so could I. He was outraged, but honestly, I was too happy to care. In the end, everything worked out exactly the way I wanted, and I could not have been more satisfied. Things had been going smoothly, despite the usual stress of planning a wedding. I was anxious and on edge, but overall, everything seemed to be falling into place until yesterday. That's when an unexpected storm of drama hit my life, and frankly, I had neither the patience nor the energy to deal with it. In short, Sarah dropped a bombshell on Dad last night. She told him he wouldn't be walking her down the aisle. Instead, she had decided to ask Arthur to do it. And if that wasn't shocking enough, she chose to break the news over a video call. It was absolutely brutal, and she could have at least been more tactful about it. We all knew how much Dad had been looking forward to her wedding. He had practically invested everything into it, financially and emotionally. Since Sarah and her fiancé wanted to save money for their honeymoon, he had covered all the expenses. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad had been juggling the stress of planning 2 weddings, but Dad had mentally checked out of mine long ago. He had zero interest in my plans, offered no input, and barely acknowledged any decisions I made. His entire focus had been on Sarah. To make things worse, he hadn't contributed a single penny toward my wedding. Kieran and I were paying for everything ourselves. At this point, I had stopped even trying to involve him. Instead, I found myself relying more on Mom and Arthur's input. Arthur, in particular, had been more engaged in my wedding than Dad had ever been, which is why Sarah's sudden request caught everyone off guard, including him. The moment she said it, Arthur looked completely stunned, clearly unsure of how to respond. He kept glancing at Mom, searching for guidance, while the rest of us sat there in awkward silence. Eventually, Mom stepped in and said that Arthur would be happy to do it. Honestly, that call was one of the most uncomfortable ones I've ever been on, and I work in corporate, where bad calls are practically a daily occurrence. But this one took the cake. Dad, on the other hand, completely lost it. Instead of confronting Sarah, the person who actually blindsided him, he turned on Arthur. He started cussing him out before abruptly disconnecting the call. And just like that, it was over. I have no doubt that the others tried to check in on him afterward, but I didn't. I had enough on my plate without getting involved in a problem that wasn't mine. This was their mess to sort out, not mine. It had been his promise to Sarah, and she was the one who broke it. If he wanted to be upset, he could take it up with her. I had no interest in inserting myself into unnecessary family drama, especially when it had nothing to do with me. Little did I know that this mess would very quickly become my problem. To my absolute frustration, Dad called me last night, completely in tears. This was just a few hours after his precious little princess had blindsided him. He was sobbing, saying he had been a fool to reject my offer to walk me down the aisle, and that he would love to do it now. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The audacity. I kept my voice calm and measured, telling him that while I genuinely felt sorry for what had happened, this was a matter between him and Sarah. It had nothing to do with me, and it didn't change anything about my wedding plans. I reminded him that Finn was already set to walk me down the aisle, something we had decided months ago, and that I couldn't just change it at the last minute. But instead of accepting that, he dismissed Finn's role entirely. He said he would talk to Finn himself, that Finn was just a placeholder for him anyway, and that I didn't need to worry because Finn would step aside once he explained things. That's when I made it clear. I wasn't worried about Finn refusing to step down. I simply didn't want to replace him. I also didn't want Dad walking me down the aisle in the first place, but he didn't need to know that. Still, he kept insisting. He was convinced that the only reason I was hesitant was because of Finn's involvement, and he was so sure he could talk Finn into stepping aside. I finally cut the call short and immediately phoned Finn to give him a heads up. To say Finn was livid would be an understatement. He asked me straight up what I wanted, and I told him exactly that. I had always wanted him to be the one to give me away. He was the first person I asked, and I only ended up asking Dad because of Finn's own hesitation. Finn then asked if I was absolutely sure that I still wanted him by my side on my wedding day. Without hesitation, I said yes. That's when he reassured me that I had nothing to worry about. He told me that if Dad tried to reach out, he would handle it. No games, no negotiations, just setting things straight. I told him that above all, I didn't want any unnecessary drama at my wedding. Dad needed to understand that he couldn't just show up whenever it suited him and treat me like a backup daughter because his favorite had thrown him aside. Finn promised to take care of it. That was last night. Since then, I've heard nothing from either of them, and it's making me sick with anxiety. Everything had been going smoothly, and now, out of nowhere, I'm stuck in the middle of this mess. I have no idea if Finn has spoken to Dad yet, or if Dad is still in denial, plotting some last-minute emotional manipulation. I feel nauseous just thinking about it. I don't know if I should reach out to them or just let things unfold on their own. I really don't have the energy for this drama right now. Update 1. I finally spoke to Finn, and things are an even bigger mess than I had imagined. But thankfully, he's handling most of it, so it shouldn't spill over and cause problems for me. Finn told me he had been waiting for Dad to call and discuss the supposed change of plans, but that call never came. That's when it hit him. Dad had no intention of talking things through. He just assumed that because he had decided to walk me down the aisle, everyone else would automatically fall in line. Finn gave him a full day to reach out, but when he didn't, Finn decided to take matters into his own hands and called him directly. He asked Dad if there was a change in plans because I had mentioned something about it. Dad, trying to play it cool, casually responded that I had asked him to walk me down the aisle since Sarah had backed out. Now, here's the thing about Finn. He's usually the most diplomatic and level-headed one among the three of us. So when he told me that he completely lost it on Dad, I was shocked. Finn said he immediately called him out on his lies, telling him to cut the crap. Both of them knew that I had never asked Dad to walk me down the aisle. Instead, it was Dad who had begged for the role after his golden child had tossed him aside. Dad, of course, exploded in anger. He has a classic habit of lashing out viciously when confronted with the truth, or anything he doesn't want to hear. But before he could start yelling, Finn shut him down. He told Dad to shut the hell up for once and actually listen to what someone else had to say. Then, Finn let loose. He told Dad that he should be grateful he was even getting an invite to my wedding, considering the way he had treated me all these years. Then, he ripped into him. After recounting the entire conversation, Finn apologized to me. He admitted that he knew it wasn't his place to lash out at Dad like that, especially just days before my wedding, but he just couldn't hold back. He wanted Dad to finally hear the truth, to stop pretending and face reality. He laid it all out. He called Dad out for favoring Sarah so blatantly, for only ever making some effort with him but completely ignoring me, and for treating me like an afterthought my entire life. And the worst part? I knew it. I had always known it. Then Finn dropped the final bombshell. He told Dad that I had always wanted him to walk me down the aisle, that he was my first choice from the very beginning. The only reason I had even asked Dad in the first place was because Finn had encouraged me to give him the chance. And what did Dad do? He threw it away. Finn said he had hoped that by taking the offer, Dad would at least try to mend his relationship with me. But instead, he proved, once again, that I had never been a priority to him. And now, he's reaping exactly what he sowed. Finn didn't hold back. He told Dad outright that he had failed as a father, because out of his 3 children, not one of us truly loved or respected him. Finn admitted that he didn't respect Dad because he had never been a fair parent to all his kids. I didn't respect him because he had never even tried to love me or treat me like his daughter. And the irony? Even Sarah didn't respect him, because if she did, she wouldn't have pulled the ruthless stunt she did. He went on to say that Dad had created Sarah's entitled, selfish personality by spoiling her rotten. He had spent years pampering and enabling her, and now that she had discarded him, he had no one to blame but himself. Finn told him that it was poetic justice. Dad had spent our entire lives disregarding his children, and now, his favorite child had done the same to him. Finn admitted that he had said a lot more in the heat of the moment, most of which he barely remembered because he had been so furious. But he reassured me that, after the reality check Dad had just received, I didn't have to worry about him pulling any more stunts. And if he did, Finn promised he would shut it down immediately. Then he made it clear there would be no changes to the wedding. He would be the one walking me down the aisle, and there was nothing in the world that could make him change that. He apologized for all the chaos, especially with the wedding so close, but I wasn't upset. If anything, I was grateful. Because for my entire life, I had never had the strength to stand up for myself like this. I had spent years believing that maybe I was the problem, that maybe Dad didn't love me because there was something wrong with me. I had tried to outgrow that feeling, but no matter how much time passed, it never fully went away. And now, here was my brother, fighting for me, standing up for me, something I had never expected anyone to do. Mom had tried to make up for Dad's neglect in her own way, but she had never truly stood up for me. I don't blame her for that, but her silence had made me believe that maybe I would never get the chance to tell Dad how horribly he had treated me. But that had finally changed. And it had changed because Finn loved me so much that he couldn't bear to see me go through it anymore. By the time he finished telling me everything, I had tears in my eyes. I was choking up as I told him that this was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for me. I don't think Finn even realizes just how much this meant to me, but to me, it was everything. Update 2. I'm officially a married woman. A few days ago, I married Kieran, and right now, we're enjoying our honeymoon in Thailand. The wedding went perfectly, no drama, no disruptions, just pure happiness. That said, things almost got messy before the big day. Dad wasn't just upset that he wasn't walking me down the aisle. He was spiraling over the fact that he wouldn't be walking either of his daughters down. And his biggest concern? How the extended family would perceive him. That was all he kept fixating on. Not the fact that he had failed as a father, not the emotional damage he had caused, just how he would look to other people. Finn had one final conversation with him before the wedding, and he shut Dad's nonsense down again. He told him, point blank, that when it came to my wedding, Dad had been emotionally absent for years anyway. So if he was missing from my wedding, he only had himself to blame. He should just be grateful that he was even invited at all. And as for Sarah, well, nobody really knows what was going through her head when she pulled her little stunt. If Dad wanted to know why she had betrayed him so coldly, maybe he needed to take a long, hard look in the mirror. Because in the end, she was his creation. Word got around to Sarah, and, of course, she had the audacity to call me. She told me that I needed to let Dad walk me down the aisle since she couldn't, and that it was unfair to him. I nearly laughed. I told her she could eat it, because she was the one who had taken his money to fund her wedding and then thrown him aside. I reminded her that when I had originally asked Dad, he was the one who chose to walk her down the aisle instead of me, because of some stupid promise that she couldn't even honor. And if she was so heartbroken over Dad's misery, well, she was more than welcome to switch things back at her wedding. I even told her that I was sure Arthur would understand. In fact, if she was feeling that guilty, I could even call him up for her and help make it happen. She had nothing to say to that, and quickly hung up. After that, I immediately called Finn and told him I was done with Dad's drama. I wanted zero distractions before my wedding, and it was his job to make sure none of it made its way to me. I had 100 other things to focus on, things I was excited about, things that mattered. I wasn't about to let Dad steal this day from me the way he had stolen so much of my childhood. Finn assured me that he would handle everything. On the day of the wedding, I was white with nerves, but thankfully, everything was under control. Dad looked miserable, but at least he kept to himself. No outbursts, no stunts, just a permanent pout plastered on his face. Not that I cared. At a certain point, I was too busy having the best day of my life to even notice his sulking. Sarah, on the other hand, kept her distance from Dad. It was beyond awkward between them, but again, not my problem. The wedding went off without a hitch, and nobody managed to ruin it. When Finn walked me down the aisle, I felt Dad's glare burning into my back, but that was all he could do. Apparently, a few people had started asking why Finn was in that role instead of Dad, and now Dad has been left scrambling to do damage control. But, well, that's his problem, not mine. Now, all I need is for Sarah's wedding to be over so I can officially be free from any lingering family drama. Once that's done, I'm planning to go low contact with Dad for the foreseeable future. I don't see the point in maintaining a relationship with him at all. Update 3. Sarah got married yesterday. Not that I'd know, because she uninvited both Kieran and me from the wedding. I don't know what she was trying to accomplish with that, but honestly, I couldn't have been happier to sit it out. To make things even funnier, Finn also didn't go. So the only people representing our side of the family were Mom, Arthur, and Dad. And Dad, he was holding out hope that at the last minute, Sarah would change her mind and let him walk her down the aisle. But she didn't. Apparently, it was awkward as hell. And judging by the photos she posted, Arthur looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else. Dad looked sullen. Arthur looked uncomfortable. And Mom? Mom just looked done. Other than that, her wedding seemed to go fine. Not that I care. Mom gave me a quick rundown over the phone, and from what she said, Dad is completely miserable. He had banked on the idea that at least one of us would eventually cave and let him play the role of the proud father. Instead, all three of his kids are practically estranged from him, and his personal life is a wreck. And he is not taking it well. But frankly, I don't care. If anything, I think it's exactly what he deserves, for being such a terrible father to me, for making my childhood so miserable, and for actively contributing to my pain. For the first time in my life, I feel free. And I have zero regrets.